Today, my presentation pertains my PhD, research in which I explored the design of paper as a material by considering and comparing the cultural context of Italy and England. This is therefore an a posteriori reflection that came from that research, and more than anything else, it reckons a direction and a ground for further investigation. So with a specific focus on Genoa, the first part of my discussion will address the long-lasting commercial relationship between Genoa and England as a route of import, but also as a means for the cultural dissemination of paper. Following that argument, I will briefly discuss the introduction and development of papermaking in England, considering the influential contributions of foreigners. The presentation concludes by suggesting how a broad geographic view in the study of history of paper can help to analyze the multiple aspects that contributed to the innovation of paper in early modern Europe. One of the first documents in Italy concerning the art of papermaking is a contract well known to Italian paper historians. First published by Briquet, the document is an agreement dated 1235 in which a laborer was employed by a papermaker and committed to obey the strict condition of not teaching or showing to anyone the mysterium, as the know-how of the art was called. The document was later referred by the literature both to highlight the resolution of papermakers to keep some secrecy over their know-how, therefore avoiding the dissemination of their art, and to remind us that the complex process of concerning the production of paper could have been hardly undertaken without the employment of a certain number of workers. In that contract, the name of the worker, Gualterius Englesius, clearly an English-born, adds a small but significant detail to the episode captured in the notarial paper. It tells us the microhistory of someone who must have moved from England to Genoa, possibly through a busy commercial route, where not only merchandise such as wool and cloth transited from England, but also people. This could have been how Gualterius had found himself being hired in a paper mill far from his homeland. We know that Gualterius was not a sole case. In the 13th century, a community of English artisans and workers, some of them even specialized, such as goldsmiths, were currently earning their living in Genoa, which is an independent republic that was building its fortune on the maritime trade, must have been an attractive site of opportunities and the ideal setting for various forms of exchange. The passage of people was not in one direction. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, Genoese galleys reached the docks of London, Sandwich, Southampton, and even Hull. Gradually, England went from being just a port of call on the route to Flanders to a profitable market on its own. The growing trade determined that on the other side of the channel, a Genoese community was settling in England. By the 15th century, Southampton became the predominant port, it being an easier dock to approach for the Genoese vessels, significantly growing in size. The Genoese in England thus established a commercial mutual reliance between the two countries. On one side, the English produced the finest wool and wool cloth. On the other, the Genoese supplied them with dye stuff and especially alum, which was vital for their textile manufacture. That relation was anything but smooth, and indeed turned rather conflictual at times. Nonetheless, in the busiest periods, it has been indicated that up to 10 Genoese merchants, along with their collaborators and employees, resided permanently in Southampton, with a couple more based in Sandwich and others in London. Although the primary goods in such an enduring exchange were centered on the textile manufacture, paper was always partaking in the Genoese export to England, for the purposes of both writing and wrapping, Among many other merchandises from all over the Mediterranean, paper was one of the few goods generally produced in Genoa. However, I don't want to focus much on the aspect of the export of Genoese paper in England, but I will rather reflect on what is possibly harder to detect from the sources. Is it possible that the exchange between the Genoese and the English was based exclusively on goods? In a situation where people, and not simply commodities, have been circulating in those countries for centuries, it is reasonable to think that a practical instrument such as paper, along with the practices that it entailed, were witnessed and gradually endorsed. Genoese merchants, in particular, were actively administrating their own business through paper. Such a practice clearly derived from Genoa's paper-driven culture, one in which notarial papers had regulated almost every aspect of life since the Middle Ages. Therefore, until the early 17th century, paper had shaped Genoa's development to the point that the businessman Domenico Peri stated, "Everything is easily rendered and brought to accomplishment by means of paper." How could the relevance of such an equipment have passed unnoticed to the English, who still significantly relied on parchment? This is one of the reasons why Juliet Fleming's definition of English early modern culture as a paper-short society sounds at least debatable as an expression. Not only because paper by the early modern period had long been imported and not exclusively by the Genoese, but also because, beside it, the resourceful practicality of paper must have been witnessed in the simple act of using it. Although at the time, some of the paper's functions were fulfilled by the parchment, paper must have been appeared a more manageable material and tool. Rather than being based on the evidence of the circulation of paper in England since the Middle Ages, and the busy interaction with paper's heavy users, Fleming's definition seems to be grounded on another circumstance. Historians know well that the manufacture of paper in England was a late one to develop in Europe. The paper mill of John Tate, operating about a decade between the 15th and 16th centuries, was greeted by the contemporaries as the accomplishment of a cherished manufacture. The fact that the publisher, Winking the Word, expressly praised Tate's English-made paper, on which he was printing, is quite a telling episode. And even more significant is the visit of the King, Henry VII, in person to Tate's paper mill. Unfortunately, the information on Tate's episode is scant. We don't know how such production was made possible, whether the mill was a genuine first production or rather the first successful attempt to make white, good quality paper, and how that experience could have trained an early generation of English craftsmen. Nonetheless, the bibliographer Alan Stevenson, who analyzed the indentation left by the molds used to produce Tate's paper, noticed a consistency with the same marks on sheets made in Italy, suggesting that a Genoese workman might have made those molds with a Tudor rose watermark specifically for John Tate. Whether a Genoese or an Italian artisan had made those personalized molds or just shared the expertise with an English artisan to make such refined instrument, the fact itself is remarkable. It reminds us that the essential proficiency to set up a manufacture had to concern every single aspect of the production, not only the profound understanding of raw materials, along with that of the process as a whole, but also the making of the necessary tools and complex devices. In all of this, the involvement of foreign artisans with their know-how must have been a key factor. Indeed, most natural way most natural way to obtain all that knowledge must have been through the contact with the same ones who had long supplied such a commodity. As the appreciation of imported paper grew, the aspiration for an English domestic production was inevitable. The mastery of paper manufacture was a coveted and cheered objective, as the appreciation of contemporaries mostly concerned the achievement of a good quality white paper to compete with that imported. The words of the author of a manual of trades are eloquent. In 1747, he stated, "We are but lately coming into the method of making tolerable paper. We were formerly supplied with that commodity from France, Holland, and Genoa." Some years ago, Maxim Berg, professor of modern economic history, highlighted one neglected foundation of the extraordinary industrial innovation in 18th century Britain. Her research explored the consequences of the remarkable circulation of foreign commodities as a factor leading to the attempt to substitute imports with domestic productions, a phenomenon that went beyond the mere duplication of foreign products. The practices of imitation, indeed, mobilized a truly creative process, which eventually resulted in a generalized product innovation. As Berg acknowledges, with a due distinction, such a progressive pattern was not specific to that historical phase, but a recurrent development in different times and cultures. And I believe that such a pattern also applies to the British paper history. The path to achieving an English production of paper comparable to that of exporting countries was indeed long and uneven. It comprised some false starts and at times required regulations, politics, and protectionist measures as explored by the literature. However, it is easy to understand how the account that emerges from the historiography has delineated a narrative that primarily focuses on the pursuit of the production of white paper and has largely ignored how that process generated a wider domestic knowledge of paper making. Paper makers had to adjust their processes, combining them with the endemic circumstances of the manufacture in England, such as the shortage of drugs, the adaptation of production sites from other manufacturers, along with the unorthodox practice of making brown and white paper in a same mill. It must have been in those circumstances that generations of British paper makers acquired their own particular proficiency by assimilating the competences of foreign craftsmen, but applying them in different conditions, while experimenting with a diverse range of fibers, assessing their properties, and subsequently envisioning possible new applications. By adopting that perspective, the production of low qualities, along with some 18th century goods, such as the pink blotting paper and pasteboard used in textile industry, acquired the significance of a research for product innovation. The same observations can be applied to the ambitious enterprise of Matthias Koops, who at the end of the 18th century tried to establish a revolutionary manufacture of paper from straw and wood. In that light, his experience appears to be consistent with the past. And although his plan eventually failed, it tangibly envisioned a future for the material of paper. That push for experimentation started out of necessity and eventually turned into a creative process, could have been the mere consequence of the pursuit of a production of white paper in England to compete with the import. The presence of foreign workers employed in English mills was vital to this process and must have been indeed a constant element of advancement. In the historiographical account, therefore, the early episode involving an Italian craftsman working for Tate appears representative of what followed, with several cases of integration of foreign expertise migrating to England from the continent. While such involvement has only been inferred for Tate's enterprise and the later one of John Spielmann, who might have introduced laborers from his homeland, Germany, the migration of skilled workers has been better attested for the Huguenots settling from France in the 17th century. Moreover, the assimilation of foreign proficiencies had to concern also the modality of use of implements. The literature indeed suggests that the introduction of the Hollander beater, adopted by the English entrepreneur Wassmann, required the expertise of Dutch craftsmen, concluding that the papermaker acquired such knowledge during a period spent abroad. The periodic attempts of foreign countries to prevent the migration of workers and with them to avoid the dissemination of the know-how had good reason then. The historiography indeed reports many single episodes of foreigners involved in English enterprises of papermaking, working abreast of local workforces. To conclude, in light of what we have seen so far, the relationship between Genoa and England is representative of how the adoption and evolution of paper constitute a multifaceted historical process, which can be analyzed not only through specific advancement, but also as a result of the movement of people and exchange of competences and technologies that made those innovations possible. Moreover, the case of English brown paper calls for further investigation, as it may shed a new light on how the deliberate adaptation aimed at overcoming certain constraints eventually led to the innovation of paper itself. Therefore, adopting a new broad pan-European perspective in the studies, not confined to national cases, can help in better understanding the complex phenomenon of the diffusion and progress of paper as a material. Thank you.